Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take stacks of information articles, research, maybe some notes, and really unpack them to get you well informed.
Yeah, cutting through the noise.
Exactly. And today, we're diving into something pretty fascinating, maybe a bit wild, actually. It's definitely been making waves online, social media, even popping up in, mainstream bookstores.
Right. This one's been hard to miss if you're anywhere near book circles on.
For sure.
Yeah.
Our source today is a segment from the YouTube channel Pop Culture Crisis. It's titled, Degenerate BookTok Romance Novels Are Rotting Women's Brain.
Quite the title.
Yeah, definitely sets a tone. So our mission here is just to explore the claims they're making, look at the examples they give, and consider the different viewpoints, the implications maybe. We're not taking sides, just trying to help you understand the whole debate.
Okay. So where do we start with that pop culture crisis segment? That title suggests they come out swinging.
Oh, they do. The opening statement is incredibly strong. They call BookTok a scourge to humanity.
Wow, okay. No holding back then.
None. And they say women reading these, what they call so-called romance novels, are a stain on the population, engaging with degenerate, disgusting things.
That's incredibly harsh language right off the bat. It really frames their whole perspective, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's provocative. So how do they try and, back that up? Do they bring in other sources early on?
They do, pretty quickly, actually. They reference an article by Ivy Lipton. It's from Evie magazine, and the title is The Porn-Rained Women of Monster Smut.
Okay, another evocative title. What's Lipton's angle?
Her main point seems to be that this content is like sexual conditioning, but it's dressed up, pretty covers, marketed as empowerment.
Empowerment.
Yeah, but she argues it's actually wreaking havoc on women's brains and sex lives. So the idea is that this entertainment isn't just harmless fun, it might be subtly changing how people think and act.
That's a heavy claim, entertainment is conditioning. So what examples do they use to illustrate this? Do they ease us in or just dive into the weirder stuff?
They start with what they call an entry-level example. It's a book called A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas.
Okay, I think I've heard of that one. Sounds like fantasy.
Yeah, the plot setup is classic fantasy. You've got Fair, a 19-year-old huntress. She kills a wolf. Then this terrifying immortal fairy, Tamlin, comes for retribution.
Right.
She gets dragged off to his magical land. Initially, they hate each other. Then, passionate love blossoms. But there's some ancient shadow complicating things. Standard stuff, sort of.
Sort of? What's the catch then, according to the video?
Well, the point they make is that despite the fantasy wrapper, when you actually crack open the book, it contains full-on graphic sex.
Ah, okay. So not just hinted at.
Apparently not. And the themes they highlight involve creatures, demons, dungeon rituals, and even women being claimed and bred by non-human creatures.
Real?
Yeah. They even draw a comparison to The Handmaid's Tale, which is quite a statement.
Definitely raises the stakes beyond typical fantasy romance. So is this kind of thing like a small underground niche, or is it bigger?
That's a key part of their argument. They stress these aren't niche books. They're massively successful, celebrated openly. You see millions of women, they say, raving about them online, like on TikTok in monster smut reviews.
Monster smut reviews, okay.
Yeah, so it's not hidden. It's out there, and it's popular.
Right, and building on that visibility, the video then moves to what they call a particularly worst example.
Yeah, they really focus on this one. A book called Morning Glory Milking Farm.
Morning Glory
Yeah.
Milking Farm. Okay, I feel like I need to brace myself here.
Probably a good idea. They start with the cover art, which they describe as controversial itself. It shows a mythical bull minotaur embracing a woman who's dressed like a milkmaid.
A minotaur, okay? And the story.
The synopsis, they say, is pure gold. You've got Violet described as a typical down-on-her-luck millennial. Lots of debt.
Relatable start.
Right. So she takes this job at Morning Glory Farm, but the clientele, they're described as grade A certified prime beef with the manly meaty endowments to match.
Oh my. Oh, are we talking about the minotaurs?
Specifically minotaurs, yes. And they highlight this line from the synopsis as foreshadowing. No choice but to grab at it with both hands.
Right. And this milking, it's clearly not about cows, is it?
Yeah.
How do they describe the process?
They go into quite some detail, actually. It involves the minotaurs sitting in a special chair. Their thing goes through a hole.
Right.
And workers milk them. There's a vacuum involved that collects the, quote, bull juices into a milk jug.
Bull juices. Wow. Okay. And why? Is there a reason for this enterprise?
Apparently. It's described as a full-on commercial enterprise producing a male enhancement vitamin.
You're kidding. A minotaur-based male enhancement vitamin?
That's what they described from the book, yeah.
And these minotaurs,
Yeah.
are they just beasts or?
That's another layer of the weirdness. They're sentient, they talk, they have jobs, they wear clothing.
They have jobs, like 9 to 5s.
Apparently. The video even mentions the book has categories for them, like clock watchers, good little cows, and super milkers.
Super milkers, okay.
And they point out the humor, or maybe the absurdity, of juxtaposing this with mundane things. Like, the synopsis apparently mentions minotaurs having student loans.
Minotaurs have student loans. That's almost funny in a very strange way.
Yeah.
Like Harry Potter needing a loan for Hogwarts, as they joked.
Exactly. It blends the totally bizarre with the everyday. So yeah, with all that detail, it really leads to their central question.
Is this actually literature, or is it just porn?
That's the core of it, yeah. They draw a direct comparison to, say, a man watching Pornhub.
Okay.
Now, they do acknowledge the ethical difference, real people in videos versus just words on a page. That's important.
Right. It's not the same thing exactly.
But their assertion is that functionally, it's just written porn, and crucially, it's being sold openly, like in Barnes & Noble. They even joke it has its own section, calling it the milk zone.
The milk zone. Okay, so this openness, this lack of hiding, that feeds into another point they make, doesn't it? About shame.
Exactly. They talk about a perceived lack of shame. They point to women reviewing these books on Amazon using their full names and faces, showing no hesitation. And the argument presented is sort of, well, in a sexually liberated society, maybe people feel entitled to explore fantasies without being judged, no matter how unconventional they are.
Right. And they have a specific example for this too, don't they? A TikTok video.
Yes, they show this TikTok clip. It's a woman introducing Morning Glory Milking Farm to her husband. Apparently, he usually reads, like, finance and sci-fi books.
Okay, probably not his usual genre, though.
Definitely not. And his first guesses about the plot are, innocently wrong, dairy farm, something with a bull.
Huh, understandable.
Then she explains the actual milking process. Very deadpan.
And how does he react?
The clip likely shows his reaction, but the commentary then pivots. They draw this parallel.
What's the comparison?
They say, imagine if the roles were reversed. Imagine a husband showing his wife a porn video about, say, step-sibling. Would the wife find that funny or just a gigantic punchline?
Ah, I see. They're suggesting a double standard in what's considered acceptable or humorous to share within a relationship.
That seems to be the point they're making, yeah. Highlighting perceived differences in social acceptance.
It's an interesting, if pointed, comparison. Now, Ivy Lipton, the author they mentioned earlier, does she offer any reason why this kind of monster smut might be so popular?
She does have a theory. Lipton suggests that maybe actual masculinity has been demonized in society.
Okay.
And her idea is that women might still crave surrender or perhaps certain power dynamics, but they're taught to distrust masculinity.
So the monsters are...
A safe loophole, that's her term. You can submit to a monster because he isn't real. The fantasy becomes a coping mechanism for desires that maybe feel taboo to explore with real men.
A coping mechanism. That's an interesting psychological angle. But the pop culture crisis video does just leave it there, right?
Yeah.
They push back on this idea of it being safe.
Immediately. They argue it's not safe. Their claim is that consuming this kind of intense content can actually rewire dopamine receptors.
Like physically change your brain.
That's the implication. That your brain gets trained to need this specific thing for arousal, making it potentially the only thing that can excite or arouse you anymore.
Wow. And that would obviously impact real relationships.
Exactly. They suggest it could seriously affect real sex lives. They even use the term milking epidemic.
A milking epidemic. Quite a phrase. Do they connect this to other kinds of addiction discussions?
They do. They compare it to discussions around porn addiction in men, noting that's generally acknowledged as a real issue, statistically more common.
Right.
But they argue that this content aimed at women often gets a pass. It's seen as safe for work, maybe, or at least more socially acceptable. It's denied as being pornography and, quote, nobody's going to call this an addiction.
So, again, that perceived double standard in how similar behaviors or consumption patterns are viewed depending on who's engaging with them.
Precisely. And it reinforces their earlier point. This stuff is not fringe anymore. We're talking millions of copies sold, huge visibility on TikTok, presence in mainstream stores. It's widespread.
Okay, so to maybe categorize all these different romantic interests, they introduce some kind of scale.
Yeah, they call it the monster fur spectrum, or sometimes the Barbeau scale.
Barbeau, like from Beauty and the Beast.
Exactly. Named after the author, Gabrielle Suzanne Barbeau de Villeneuve. It's a scale to categorize the non-human love interests.
Okay, what are the categories?
It goes from like human pro, maybe someone enhanced.
Yep.
Shifter, humanoid creature, non-humanoid creature. And then the final category is just, what F is that?
Chuckles slightly. Okay. And they equate that last one with?
With bestiality, essentially. That's the line they draw.
And how do they position familiar fantasy stuff like Twilight or Harry Potter on this scale?
They mention them, yeah. Vampires in Twilight or animatic in Harry Potter humans who can turn into animals. They acknowledge those exist. But they argue that this BookTok stuff is a far cry from that. It's pushing boundaries much, much further down that spectrum into the more extreme categories.
I see. So they're drawing a very clear line between traditional fantasy romance and this newer wave.
A very sharp line. And this leads to a discussion about, well, a perceived lack of introspection from the people reading this stuff. They question if consumers are thinking about what it says about them. And they even connect it, maybe controversially, to the girl boss mentality.
How so?
The implication seems to be that this modern idea of female empowerment might lead some to dismiss any criticism or ignore traditional social boundaries, sort of an I can do whatever I want attitude, even if it involves, well, minotaur milking farms.
Right. And they wrap this all up with a pretty stark final comment, don't they? And a call to action.
Yeah, a very provocative closing thought. We're 5 years away from PetSmart looking like a truck stop.
Wow. Okay, that's bleak. Implying a slippery slope towards societal degradation, basically.
Pretty much. And this is where they explicitly call for shaming as a necessary form of societal pushback against this whole trend.
Right. A call to bring back social judgment for these kinds of choices.
That's the final takeaway from there.
So quite a journey we've taken there. We've really dived into this evolving landscape of romance, or as the source argues, written porn, and the really intense debates it's causing online.
Definitely intense. From fairy romance that gets graphic all the way to, yeah, minotaur milking farms.
We looked at the theories behind why it's popular, the arguments about how it might be affecting minds, relationships.
The whole dopamine rewiring claim, the comparisons to porn addiction.
Yeah. As you think about all this we've unpacked, maybe just consider that line between fantasy and reality. How much does what we consume in fiction, even seemingly outlandish fiction, actually shape, what we expect or desire in our real lives?
That's definitely a question worth mulling over. How separate are those worlds, really?
Something to think about.